Hey internets, I am back from vacation and so it is now time for a quick rant. This one is going to be about the localizer question, because unfortunately it seems that some elitist twats still think that it's a translator's job to inject their dumb neo-Marxist politics into the media they are translating, regardless of what the original creator of the media intended to convey, instead of, just properly doing their job translating it accurately. And of course, those of you who follow me on X, yes, this video is basically just me elaborating further into a post I did there, which, by the way, you should probably follow me on X if you haven't already. I'm trying to build a presence there so that in case I get shadow banned, demonetized, or just have my channel outright nuked or whatever, because unfortunately big tech censorship is still very much a thing. If you follow me on X, you'll be able to still find my content, as well as other various memes and takes I've had on there. But anyway, to start this elaboration off, I'll just begin with the post I wrote. Localizer is a job that, in an actual free market without regulation, would likely be paid very little, if anything at all. We can prove this by just looking at the anime fansub scene. Before the Crunchyroll days, it's the fansub groups who produce accurate translations that were the closest to the original Japanese meaning, while still being understandable, that were the most popular and consistently saw the largest torrenting or downloading volume. Even now, with official subs coming out on day one, the teams that do their job on top of that still show this pattern. And also, just to clarify what I meant by that, I mean that fansub teams that do fansubbing on top of official subs that are already out before their fansub has been created, the fansubbers that do well tend to still be the ones that try to translate as accurate as possible, as opposed to localizing. We also see fans making mods for the games that have been shat on and butchered by these woke-toid psychopaths to reverse their act of injecting their stupid ideology into media from a culture that they, the localizer schloppers, clearly have no respect for. We also already see fansubber groups removing woke trash from anime, and all they are doing when they do so is they're just translating it correctly like it should have been done in the first place. The only time localization is viewed as acceptable by most consumers is when during translation one word lacks a good enough lexical match in the language it is being translated to, thus forcing the translator to get creative. What does this tell us? Simple. Absolutely no one would buy brain-dead activist localizer slop without the authoritarian nonsense that is our current intellectual property law granting it an intellectual monopoly. That's why it's always some pathetic lackey being paid by some IP-holding mega corporation to inject this idiotic propaganda. Therefore, localizer as a job, distinct from simple and respectful translation, is little more than a parasitic fake job created by government regulation, or in other words, it just wouldn't survive if that regulation didn't exist. Thus, it exists purely off the backs of violating people's rights. They should be paid $0, zilch, nada, nothing. That's the general gist of the problem with localizers. But there's a bit more that needs to be pointed out here. First off, I really need to emphasize that this is not just quote-unquote my opinion. Rather, this take, specifically in the context of anime and manga being translated from Japanese to English, is something we actually have pretty strong evidence is true. Back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s to some degree, marketers still hadn't quite wrapped their poor little normie brains around how exactly they could market anime to the Western audience and how exactly it would be received. And so because of this, a lot of early translations of anime to English back then were really, really bad. I mean, really comically bad. If you just search for a history of 4Kids entertainment, you'll find a lot of examples of how bad it was. But the thing that people often miss about it is it's actually in many ways worse than you realize. Because in some aspects of storytelling, it actually kind of ruins the character. Like, for example, when they changed that guy from One Piece's cigarette into a lollipop. On the surface of things, in a very pedantic level, it's understandable, because they're trying to edit the series for a Western audience which tends to view cartoons as more kiddish. And we can't have smoking in a kid's cartoon. So from a marketer's perspective of someone who's not really putting much thought into it, it makes sense. Until, of course, you think about it from the perspective of understanding creative writing. Because when it comes to writing, there's a few different aspects to a character. Good stories always try to tell as much as they possibly can with as little as they possibly can. And so a writer will often try to imply things about a character's personality, but not outright state them. This is called indirect characterization. It's the character's implied thoughts and opinions and how they view life, based on how they're acting on screen. And so when you change a character's cigarette to a lollipop, the problem is you're actually changing that character's internal thoughts. And because it's being done purely to localize and not because it actually makes sense within the story, these changes will often make very little sense in the rest of the plot. it'll make it appear as if the character's acting in ways that go against their characterization. And so that's what's so bad about this kind of localization slop. The way the character acts and behaves and appears to think doesn't really make sense as someone who's constantly sucking on a lollipop. It kind of breaks the internal logic of the story. And of course, as a result of that, the fans don't really like it. And it's not just disliking censorship for the sake of disliking censorship, or disliking changes made by a localizer just for the sake of purity, but it's also because it's just really, really stupid writing. For instance, imagine if they took the lightsabers from Star Wars and turned them into pool noodles, but then kept a lot of the rest of the story the same. The story in context with everything else going on just wouldn't make any sense. Why are these guys fighting with pool noodles when outside there's a war for the galaxy going on with laser cannons? Why do these guys with pool noodles matter? The logic of the universe, when you change things like that, just kind of starts to break down. And so it also breaks verisimilitude. People start to have a really hard time hanging on to their suspension of disbelief that you kind of have to enjoy pretty much anything. And so the result is that a lot of this early localizer schlop ended up with fans, well, refusing to buy it. And that's where we see the evidence behind the problem. Anime piracy back then used to be at an extreme all-time high, with some people preferring even second or third-hand fan sub VHS tapes over officially licensed tapes. And of course, as Gabe Newell proved, piracy is more of a service issue rather than an actual payment issue. It has been proven that people will pay for things if the product is good, and mainly if it is not inferior to the pirated product. Because of course the issue is that back then, it wasn't just between pirating anime for free and paying for it. The problem is it wasn't the same product. If you had a choice between watching a localizer slop version of anime, where they change cigarettes to lollipops and guns to squirt guns, and a bunch of other nonsense, basically completely crapping on the story and making it no longer make any sense, versus the pirated version, which were more faithful translations, more accurate to what the actual story was. And so, therefore, of course, it's kind of a no-brainer why fans chose to pirate back then. And what we're seeing today is really just an extension of that. Because these days, the neo-localizer slop is changing the story of anime to usually make it more in terms with the cathedral, basically injecting neo-Marxist woke ideology into things. There's many examples of this, but one of the worst and most outrageous examples often given is within the dub for Dragon Maid. The character Lukoa, who was previously wearing something relatively revealing, comes into the place of the main characters wearing something a bit more covered up. And so she's asked what's with the new outfit, and the answer she gives is that everyone was always saying something to me, so I tried toning down the exposure. How is it? And then of course in the Funimation dub they changed this line to, oh, those pesky patriarchal societal demands were getting on my nerves, so I changed clothes. Now, aside from just injecting dumb Western feminism into a location where it clearly doesn't belong, even if it wasn't dumb politics being injected here, it would still be really bad, because the problem, again, comes down to indirect characterization. It breaks the logic of Lukoa's character. She's supposed to be a laid-back dragon who is trying to get along with humans simply because she's aloof and finds it easier to do. And so the internal thoughts of the character are more about how she can fit in to a society that she's completely removed from. So she's supposed to be kind of a silly, airheaded character. And the line change about feminism, what it actually did is it changed the reasons for why she was doing something. It changed the internal thoughts of the character. So instead of changing her outfit to be more easygoing with humanity, they changed her motives to be this kind of cunty, passive-aggressive, misandrist whining about male gaze or whatever. Basically, they injected woke puritanism into her personality. And that doesn't make any sense, because Lukoa is not a character that actually is supposed to care about woke puritanism. She's not actually written to think this way, and so of course, sure enough, in many other episodes that she appears, a disconnect forms with her indirect characterization and her implied thoughts and implied motives for why she does what she does. Which is especially weird because in the original Japanese version, she was kind of intended to be a fan service character. And so here, a Funimation is basically lecturing the audience, telling them, oh no, you shouldn't find this character attractive, male sexuality bad. And so it's just completely self-contradictory. It doesn't make any sense at all. The character wasn't originally written to be a passive-aggressive feminist, and so the various scenes and situations that she exists in aren't written with that in mind. And so by changing that in her characterization, Funimation accidentally made it so every single scene she appears in doesn't make sense anymore, because now her implied thoughts are different than what the original writer was trying to convey, and so thus the soft storytelling storytelling aspects also become inaccurate. And that's kind of the basic reason why localization should be kept to a minimum. That's why you should only do it, as I mentioned earlier, when there just isn't a good dictionary match in the two languages. But also because fans don't like it because it makes the story suck. But rather, it's an issue of IP abuse and corporations not really learning anything because of. Under free market circumstances where IP rights are not treated as unquestionable dogma, they would see the fact that fans are overwhelmingly choosing not to buy their product as evidence that there's something wrong with their product, that the competition, in this case fan subgroups who don't go out of their way to pervert the story, is simply providing a better product that consumers, actually want. But because of the tendency to view this as simply lay piracy and lay bad and lay eagle, the corporations instead incorrectly look at the piracy data as a lost sale, and thus, in a twist of irony, intellectual property rights actually end up causing the corporations to make less rational decisions. But the reality is, if the studios that created the anime in Japan themselves started releasing their own official subs or dubs for streaming and gave customers two different tracks, one being relatively accurate with exceptions of no lexical match, and one being mistranslated with a bunch of localized schlop injected with neo-Marxist nonsense, well, we already know which one the fans would overwhelmingly choose. And that's why corporate localizers deserve all the scorn that they get. The crappy job that they have been doing would, on a fair level playing field, hardly earn them a single dime. And so that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and if you like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch. Thanks again, that is all, till next time.